My name is Erin. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Welcome everyone to the History Behind the Crime, the pilot episode. I've been interested in true crime since I was a pretty young teen when my mom told me a story of a man named Ted and his Volkswagen Beetle. Instead of being properly horrified like any normal person would be, I was more interested in why someone would do something so horrible and how police finally apprehended him. My fascination led me to a short stint as a law enforcement officer in the United States Coast Guard and to a few jobs in psychiatric hospitals before I pursued my degree in history. I know that there are a lot of true crime podcasts out there, and if you're listening to this, thank you. But I wanted to create this podcast to explore the events around crime. As a historian, I document the when, where, why, what, and how. And as I listen to some of my favorite podcasts, I continue to ask these questions. I guess it's difficult to turn off my historian brain at times. So even as a teenager, I wondered how it was so easy for Ted Bundy to abduct his victims, to only realize later in life that society at the time encouraged women to be friendly, despite their instincts telling them to run, and police telling women not to fight their rapists. Obviously, there is more behind that victimology, but society norms at the time played an important role in Bundy's abductions. History can help us better understand these crimes and, perhaps, help law enforcement and citizen detectives solve cold cases and prevent more crimes from happening in the future. This is something I can only hope for. For this first episode, I want to explore the history behind a crime that had an impact on my childhood. In fact, I can still remember what I was doing on that day. On April 19th, 1995, I was boarding a school bus with my other sixth grade classmates on our way to the Will Rogers Museum in Claremore, Oklahoma. Some of us were disappointed because we had already seen the museum, and we were bummed because the original plan was a field trip to the state capitol in Oklahoma City. To this day, I still believe it was fate that made the teachers and administrators switch plans a few weeks before the trip. Shortly before 9 a.m., a rented Ryder truck pulled up to the front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and at 9:02 a.m., a fertilizer and diesel bomb exploded from within the truck and took out a third of the building, killing 168 people and injuring more than 600. 19 children were among the dead. A little over an hour later, an Oklahoma state trooper pulled over a car for having no license plate, and the driver was arrested for concealing a firearm. That man turned out to be Timothy McVeigh. And after tracking down the Ryder truck rental location in Kansas, obtaining a composite of the suspect, and identifying a suspect through that composite, the FBI took custody of McVeigh and found trace evidence on his clothes and a note that read, "TNT at $5 a stick. Need more." After an intense investigation that netted over 28,000 interviews, 43,000 investigative leads, 3.5 tons of evidence, and nearly 1 billion pieces of information, the federal government tried McVeigh and his accomplice, Terry Nichols, for multiple counts of murder. McVeigh got the death sentence. Nichols got life without parole. A third man, Michael Fortier, spent a few years in prison for knowledge of the plot, but was released and is now in the Witness Protection Program. That's the crime. It's horrific, shocking, and the deadliest act of domestic-based terrorism in the United States. But what caused McVeigh and Nichols to do it? Why would two seemingly normal men, two U.S. military veterans, blow up a federal building? A federal building with a daycare in it. To answer these questions, we need to take a look at what was going on in the U.S. during the 1980s and 90s. I do want to warn you, what I am about to discuss contains narratives that might remind you of what is going on in our nation today. But this is a podcast about history, and sometimes, unfortunately, history has a way of repeating itself. This is a story about separatists, racism, militarized law enforcement, and military veterans turned extremists. While researching this story, I read Kathleen Belew's book, Bring the War Home, Jess Walter's book about Ruby Ridge, and watched and read several other pieces about those events and Waco, Texas. In the 1980s, there was I guess you can call it a shift in racist rhetoric. The days of white sheets and burning crosses were disappearing, and rather than stay in their communities and terrorize marginal groups, white racists began to move to areas where local populations were predominantly white. This is where the term white separatist came from. To be honest, before my research, I knew little about these groups, aside from them, hating the government, hating minorities, and loving their guns. I knew very little about their creeds, their beliefs, and the literature they peddled at gun shows. Now I feel like I need a shower whenever I think of their conspiracy theories about the Jewish-headed Zionist occupational government, which is called ZOG for short, or the New World Order. This is the world that Timothy McVeigh embraced and what people today casually throw around. During the 1980s and 90s, these white separatists came to mistrust the federal government, encroaching on their Second Amendment rights and waging a war against civilians. To be fair, okay, this was a time when the federal government sold state and local police forces surplus military gear, and federal law enforcement agencies made a few missteps that made even the most ardent lover of law enforcement wince. We'll get to those in a moment, but it's important to understand some of these theories of these white separatist groups. One of the theories, ZOG, was both anti-communist and anti-Jewish. It was the held belief that Jews controlled the federal government, the United Nations, banks, and Hollywood, and employed minorities, communists, the academia, journalists, and liberals to eradicate the white race and its culture. To combat the ZOG, these groups enlisted young white men, not women, into a world of paramilitary camps with military-grade weapons and specifically targeted Vietnam veterans who were left disillusioned after the conflict in Vietnam. Come join our ranks, buddies. It was a place where men could be men and gender roles were very pronounced. Simply put, the men were the protectors of the white culture, and white women were expected to breed more white children and produce more white soldiers. In order to do this, many white separatists escaped to the Pacific Northwest, where the forests and mountains offered, a little bit of privacy, and many small towns had little or no black occupants. The Weavers were one of those families who moved to the rural area of northern Idaho to practice their white separatist culture and to just be left alone. Brandy and Vicki Weaver moved with their growing family to a 20-acre piece of land on Ruby Ridge in 1983, which offered both privacy and a chance to live off the land. Following a dispute, a neighbor of the Weavers turned informant to the FBI and Secret Service and told law enforcement that Randy Weaver planned to kill prominent figures such as then President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. He made it up, but it still started an investigation into the Weavers and set the stage for tragedy. Though both Randy and Vicky denied being white supremacists, federal investigations confirmed that the Weavers had attended Aryan Nation meetings, which, try to talk yourself out of that one, and attended church gatherings aimed to attract white separatists. While the Weavers may or may not have been white supremacists, which it sounds like they were, a 1985 investigation showed that 2 Weaver adults had not committed any crimes. For the most part, they were law-abiding citizens. In this country, being a white supremacist is not against the law. You may not be the best person in the world, but you're not a criminal. So that was until 1989, when Randy Weaver apparently sold an alcohol, tobacco, and firearms informant 2 sawed-off shotguns, which is against the law. It was the perfect ammunition to turn Randy Weaver into an informant for the ATF. The agency wanted informants to infiltrate the white supremacist militias in the Pacific Northwest. And Randy Weaver was not only a visiting member of those organizations, but he wanted to start his own battle against the Zog. Even though the ATF had evidence to charge Weaver with weapons crimes, Randy declined to turn snitch and claimed the ATF had entrapped him. Listen, I don't like white supremacists more than anyone else does. I seriously think that they're on the wrong course, and I pity them for their misguided ways. But what really hacks me off is I just can't abide law enforcement bending or breaking the law to get a bigger fish. The evidence against Weaver was sketchy at best, and a grand jury only indicted Weaver on making and possessing illegal weapons and not selling them. Weaver was arrested and made bail, but he failed to show up to his court date either due to administration errors, such as, giving Randy Weaver the wrong date for court, or the simple fact that maybe Randy wanted to give the government a big screw you. This caused the presiding judge to issue a bench warrant, and the case passed to the United States Marshal Service. But the Marshal Service was not told that the ATF tried to turn Weaver into a snitch. So the ATF failed to properly brief the United States Marshals. Compounding the situation even more was Randy Weaver's serious mistrust of the government and the statements he made that he would resist any effort to bring him in. It was a tinderbox just waiting to go off. For the purpose of this podcast, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow of the events that happened at Ruby Ridge in the late summer of 1992. There is a great PBS American Experience documentary about it, and Jess Walter's book really gets into the finer details. I will say that on August 21st, 1992, 6 U.S. Marshals went up to the Weaver place to scout out the area in order to plan the arrest of Randy Weaver. Unfortunately, one of the Weaver dogs alerted the family and a family friend, Kevin Harris, of the Marshals' presence, and the armed confrontation began. The dog was the first victim killed by a United States Marshal. Then, Deputy Bill Deegan was shot and killed by Harris. And then Weaver's 14-year-old Sammy was shot in the back and killed by Deputy Larry Cooper. It was a cluster of epic proportions, and controversy still surrounds who exactly fired the first shot. The shootout was the opening salvo of an 11-day siege. The U.S. Marshals, rightly so, called in reinforcements from local Idaho law enforcement agencies and the FBI. and the Idaho governor declared a state of emergency in the county, which allowed the use of the state's National Guard and its military grade weapons and armored personnel carriers. So all this firepower was called in just for one family and two armed gunmen in this house. Normally, it would have only been SWAT and a few, hostage negotiators. But this, the United States Marshals, the FBI, local law enforcement, and the National Guard, all to take down just two people. So the FBI also sent in its hostage rescue team, which is the tactical arm of the FBI. So think, SWAT on steroids. Several hundred law enforcement officers took part in the Ruby Ridge siege. As more law enforcement took their places on August 22nd, the FBI sent out rules of engagement that, in a nutshell, said that deadly force was authorized against any adult carrying a weapon around the Weavers' home. A bit later, the rules of engagement were slightly modified to say any adult male in order to exclude Vicky. That same day, an FBI sniper attempted to take out Weaver, in the presence, mind you, of Weaver's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah. But the sniper only wounded Weaver. When the sniper made his second shot, he killed Vicky by mistake. Vicky was holding her 10-month-old daughter when she was shot. It was only after Bo Gritz, a retired Special Forces Army Lieutenant Colonel, popular among white militias, intervened and talked Weaver into surrendering. Only then did the siege end. Both Weaver and Harris stood trial for their involvement in the siege, but each one was acquitted, and Weaver only went to prison for the initial charge of missing his court date. The FBI and the ATF were vilified in the press and in public opinion, and white supremacists and militias everywhere went crazy over Ruby Ridge. Even during the siege, local townfolk and not-so-local supremacists and militias gathered as close to the cabin as law enforcement would allow to show their support to the Weavers and protest federal law enforcement. The events at Ruby Ridge, at least in their minds, just proved what they had been preaching all along. The federal government was out to destroy their white way of life and to take their guns. Look, they're even killing our women and children. There was one man who definitely took notice while watching the events unfold on TV, Timothy McVeigh. Who is Timothy McVeigh? McVeigh was born into what seems to be a normal, middle-class family in Lockport, New York in 1968. While reading his biography, I got a sense he was on the nerdy and awkward side. He loved computers, but he had no idea how to impress girls. After his grandfather introduced him to hunting and guns, McVeigh became obsessed with them and the Second Amendment. In 1988, McVeigh joined the United States Army and, for the most part, fit in pretty well. But there were some red flags during his service. At basic and infantry school, McVeigh got into a bit of trouble after he purchased a white power t-shirt at a Klan rally. Which, once again, going to Klan rally isn't necessarily against the law. It's just kind of frowned upon in the military. McVeigh also used racial slurs and treated black subordinates with disdain while showing white subordinates preferential treatment. He even joined a Klan group in North Carolina, which back then in the United States Army was not against the rules. During Desert Storm, McVeigh said he was proud he killed an Iraqi soldier, but at the same time was disturbed when he was ordered to execute surrendering prisoners. Now, I can't find any evidence he was ever given this order. However, McVeigh did manage to impress some of his Army leadership, and he attended Ranger School, which he washed out of. Disillusioned and probably embarrassed, McVeigh left the Army in 1991 with an honorable discharge. After his time in the Army, McVeigh worked menial, dead-end jobs, struck out in the dating department, and developed a gambling habit. He made comments about bringing pain to the ones he loved and claimed he had no home. Here's the sad fact about what McVeigh went through post active duty. Many veterans go through some sort of dramatic or traumatic transition back into the civilian life. Many develop deep depression and a sense of not belonging. It doesn't matter if you were in for 2 years or 20 years. The adjustment can be pretty confusing, and the average person has a difficult time understanding why veterans turn to unhealthy habits such as drinking, drug use, gambling, self harm, or even violence. If you're listening to this thinking that was just a little push for better services for veterans, well, it is. Obviously, I cannot say that with proper care, McVeigh wouldn't have killed nearly 200 people. But I can say better support for veterans may prevent future tragedies and help them find a healthy way to resolve their PTSD, trauma, and difficulties transitioning into a new life and not turn to organizations that give them a false sense of belonging while actively preaching hate and committing hate crimes. But that's just my thought of the week. I digress. Post-Army life was not easy for McVeigh. He fell deeper into his hate for minorities and the government, pushed his anti-government beliefs onto his sister, and quit the National Rifle Association because he believed they were just a little bit too warm and fuzzy for him. His life spiraled more towards radicalism after the events in Texas in 1993. Once again, I'm not going to go full board into the events that happened at Waco. There's way too much history there with the Branch Davidians and David Koresh. Frontline, love PBS, has a pretty good episode about the siege, and Waco, the rules of engagement, was also pretty insightful. There's also several books, hundreds of books, about Waco and the Branch Davidians, even some authored by people who took part in the siege, on both sides. Once again, in the proverbial nutshell, the Branch Davidians were an apocalyptic cult led by David Koresh, who was accused of stockpiling illegal weapons and child abuse at their compound at Mount Carmel, Texas, just a few miles away from the town of Waco. Like Ruby Ridge, law enforcement officers, this time with the ATF, attempted to serve search warrant at Mount Carmel when a gunfight erupted on February 28, 1993. Who started the shootout? We don't know. Law enforcement, Branch Davidians, and conspiracy theorists all claim different things. What we can all agree on is that the shit went epically sideways. After a 2.5-hour gunfight, 4 ATF agents were killed and 20 were wounded, while 5 Branch Davidians were killed and an unknown number were wounded. A ceasefire was negotiated, and the FBI was called in while Koresh preached to his followers that the end had finally come. The FBI also brought in their HRT unit, headed by the same man who led the team during Ruby Ridge. After a few days of negotiations, the cult released 19 children, but nearly 100 people, including 23 children, remained in the compound. In order to expedite an ending to the siege, the FBI used sleep deprivation tactics against the cult, playing loud music, chanting, and even the sound of rabbits being slaughtered. They also brought in a Bradley combat vehicle and combat engineer vehicles, also known as tanks. Soon, the FBI also cut off the power and water to the compound. The sleep deprivation tactics and cutting off utilities to the compound may sound harsh, especially in the presence of children, for God's sakes, but it was much more peaceful than what eventually did happen. After a few days, 11 adults eventually did leave the compound. The rest of the children didn't. During the siege, the presence of law enforcement not only escalated, but the presence of anti-government militia and white supremacist observers did as well. Despite the fact that the Branch Davidians were an all-inclusive, group and had people of all different races within their flock. These militias and white supremacists still saw the siege at Waco as another example of the federal government declaring war on people practicing their Second Amendment rights, and the federal government was destroying white culture, even if the Branch Davidians were not white supremacists. One of these people who came to view the siege was Timothy McVeigh. He drove down to Texas not only to, look and see what was going on, but also to sell anti-government bumper stickers. After 51 days, the situation grew dire on both sides. The FBI, U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, and President Bill Clinton were afraid of the continuation of child abuse and the very real possibility of mass suicide within the compound. Both Reno and President Clinton signed off on an HRT assault, which began on April 19th. The HRT used 50 cal weapons and tanks, but the tanks were only to be used to deflect gunfire, crossover obstructions, and pump tear gas into buildings. The HRT were given strict instructions not to fire unless fired upon. Unlike Ruby Ridge, the FBI never fired a shot on April 19th. They only lobbed tear gas and flashbangs into the compound. Sometime around noon, fires broke out within the compound and soon engulfed the building. 76 people within the building died. They were either burned to death, died in the rubble, were suffocated, or they were shot. It was another black eye for the FBI. Conspiracy theorists claim that the FBI burned the building down, but in surveillance audio, Koresh can be heard ordering his followers to pour gasoline throughout the building on the day of the assault. Whether or not the FBI was to blame for the fire, the white power movement saw the events at Waco as a massacre against white women and children and white reproduction. It was just another example of the New World Order. Some swore revenge, and white militia membership exploded to over 50,000 members in 47 states. The events at Ruby Ridge and Waco angered McVeigh. He thought it was his duty to prepare other white people for a war against the federal government. He started to work at gun shows across the United States, 80 shows in total. And he peddled anti-government and hate literature and merchandise, including William Luther Pierce's The Turner Diaries, fictional novel about a violent revolution against the federal government that leads to the systemic extermination of non-whites. The Turner Diaries was, and still is, inspirational to many white supremacists and inspired McVeigh to construct his weapon of choice. McVeigh traveled around the country and stayed briefly with Michael Fortier in Arizona, experimenting with marijuana and meth, and joined a Klan group once headed by the infamous David Duke. He then ventured up north to Michigan, where Terry Nichols tutored McVeigh on explosives and shared their anti-government and hate rhetoric with each other. Both men became further enraged with the passage of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which mandated a 5-day waiting period on the purchase of handguns. To McVeigh and Nichols, it was just further proof that the government was out to take away their Second Amendment rights, and compared the ATF to Nazis. In fact, he's quoted as saying, "It was during this time the two men began to make bulk purchases of ammonium nitrate and fertilizer and created an assassination list that included judges, FBI agents, and even Janet Reno. When they decided assassination would probably be too difficult, they set their sights on bombing a federal building and fingered the Murrah building as their target, because another group, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, also affiliated with the Order and Aryan nations, attempted to blow up the building with a rocket launcher in 1983. On the morning of April 19th, 1995, 3 years to the day after the final tragedy at Waco, McVeigh drove the rented Ryder truck up to the federal building, parked, and then walked away. It was his revenge against the federal government. During many interviews, McVeigh claimed he acted alone, saying, "Isn't it kind of scary that one man would wreak this kind of hell?" And the FBI, still reeling from the fallout of Ruby Ridge and Waco, were hesitant to portray the Oklahoma City bombing attack as a work of a movement, even though FBI criminology studies stated McVeigh contradicted the lone wolf terrorist acting under his own steam. McVeigh was easy to control and manipulate and was motivated by the white power movement, the studies proclaimed. Indeed, many times McVeigh came under the leadership of several white power and anti-government militia leaders such as John Trockman of Michigan, Jack Oliphant of the Arizona Patriots, and Mark Cornick, who led an anti-government militia in Florida. Of course, all these men denied even knowing McVeigh and Nichols, but that was the way these organizations were. They would rile up younger men, feed them lies and hate, and point them in the direction of their targets. On the surface, it looked as if these men worked alone, but in reality, the top brass was just saving their own ass while watching their plans come to fruition. On August 10th, 1995, McVeigh was indicted on 11 federal counts, including 8 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of law enforcement officers. In February the following year, the judge granted a change of venue to Denver from Oklahoma City because, well, hell, let's face it, everyone in Oklahoma was out for blood. McVeigh tried to persuade his lawyers that his actions were justified because he felt he was in imminent danger from the federal government after the, quote, war crimes at Waco. Obviously, his attorneys decided not to make that argument in court. And on June 2nd, 1997, McVeigh was found guilty of all 11 charges. On June 12th, the jury recommended the death penalty, which he got. Because of this, the state of Oklahoma declined to pursue state charges against McVeigh. They did pursue state charges against Nichols after the federal government convicted him of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy and sentenced him to life without parole. The state of Oklahoma convicted Nichols on 161 counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy and also sentenced him to life without parole. Nichols is currently serving his sentence at the federal ADX Supermax prison in Colorado. McVeigh was put to death by lethal injection on June 11, 2001 in Terre Haute, Indiana. As I prepared this podcast, it really did strike me how this historical analysis really was a cause and effect analysis. And I wonder if Ruby Ridge and Waco never happened when McVeigh had become so radicalized. Would he still have bombed the Murrah building? Or would he have just become that bigoted old man that no one invites to family gatherings because they don't want to hear his conspiracy theories about Jews shooting lasers from space? If the FBI had only used a few agents to de-escalate the crisis at Ruby Ridge and Waco and not militarize the scenes, would McVeigh have chilled a little? I can't answer that. I do know groups have a way of riling people up. Think about it. Some dude alone in his house watching his favorite sports team is not going to go as nuts as he would in a stadium filled with fans. At home, he's just passionate. At a game, his shirt suddenly comes off and he's doing chest bumps with the guy next to him. The same is true with white supremacists. One white supremacist is just an asshole, but put them together and they start encouraging each other to terrorize others. It's nothing new. and has been seen all throughout history. Finally, I want to take a moment at the end of every podcast to take a look at a missing person or cold case. This week, because I know a lot of my Oklahoma friends are listening, I wanted to draw attention to the 2013 missing persons case of Colt Haynes and Molly Miller out of Love County, Oklahoma. On July 7th, 2013, Colt Haynes and Molly Miller were passengers in a vehicle driven by James Knipp and were involved in a car chase with the Wilson Police Department. Police lost the vehicle in the area of Long Hollow Road and Oswalt Road in Love County. Haynes and Miller disappeared after the pursuit. On July 8th, they called friends asking for water and a ride, saying they were lost somewhere near Oswalt Road. 2 weeks later, the vehicle involved in the pursuit was found abandoned in the woods south of Oswalt Road. Colt and Molly have not been seen since. If you know anything about the disappearances of Colt and Molly, please contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation at 800-522-8017 or tips at osbi.ok.gov. If you feel uncomfortable going directly to the authorities, you can always reach out to me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you may know people in Oklahoma who do. Share Colt and Molly's story with them. So thanks for listening to this pilot episode of The History Behind the Crime. I'll be back next time with another true crime historical analysis. So until then, do me a favor. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Thanks.